Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the center. Just a formal introduction, as Dr. Agarwal said. Dr. Ruth DeFries is the Dennings Family Professor of Sustainable Development in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, and the co-director of the undergraduate program in Sustainable Development at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Her areas of expertise include the role of tropical landscapes in climate adaptation and mitigation, conservation, food security, and human livelihoods. She uses images from satellites and field surveys to examine how the world's demand for food and other resources are changing land use throughout the tropics. Her research quantifies how these land use changes affect climate, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services, as well as human development. Professor DeFries was elected to the prestigious United States Academy of Sciences, and she's also the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award and of the highest-ranking university professorship at Columbia. In addition to publishing numerous scientific papers, she's committed to communicating the nuances and complexities of sustainable development to popular audiences, most recently through her book, The Big Ratchet: How Humanity Thrives in the Face of Natural Crisis. She is also committed to linking science with policy through her involvement with Environmental Defense Fund, Science for Nature and People, the World Wildlife Fund, and conservation projects in Central India. Her institutional leadership has led to the creation of several innovative Earth Institute programs, and her public advocacy is responsible for advances around the world concerning climate change, food, waters, and nature conservation. So, please welcome.
Okay. I have this. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for being here, all of you. I hope you enjoyed the snacks. So India is my second home, and there are a lot of reasons why I love this country. The variety, the vibrancy, the diversity, but most of all, of course, the food. And the variety of the food. So we think about a roti, but there are so many ways to think about a roti: a bajra ki roti, a jawar ki roti, a paratha, a puri. There's so many ways to think about rotis, and cereals being the major part of diets. And a roti is more than a roti. There are so many implications on environment, on nutrition, on land use, on culture, that go into decisions about what we grow, what farmers grow, and what we choose to eat. So I've been working with some collaborators, an interdisciplinary project that just grew organically because we're all interested in this topic, in political ecology, nutrition, food systems, energy systems, and we all realized that we were jointly very interested in this growing interest of what's now called nutri-cereals in India, and we need to understand it holistically. We need to understand in all dimensions: the cultural part, the nutritional aspects, the environmental aspects. So we put our heads together for the last couple of years and trying to look at this question of how cereals relate to environment and nutritional aspects. And I'd like to share some of that work with you today. So now the official government term is nutri-cereals, and this is a bit of a fad now. It's trendy. You can go up the street to Fab India, you can go online, you can go into fancy restaurants and find bajra or jawar or other small millets. This is just in the last couple of years. Is this a fad that is just for the urban elite? Or is this movement something that can help in addressing the many nutritional and environmental problems that there are in India's food system? So we wanted to look at this, not from the point of view of we like it because it's romantic, or it tastes good, although it does, or that it's trendy, but trying to understand what a movement back to including more of these nutri-cereals in diets could actually mean for multiple dimensions of environment and nutrition. So stepping back from India to the global food system, where are we now at this point? We know we have many challenges in our global food system. Some aspects are positive and some aspects are negative. In the positive aspect, we forget sometimes that just 50 years ago there were a lot more famines, a lot more people who couldn't afford food. We're living in a time of abundant and inexpensive calories. And that's, on one hand, a good thing because it has alleviated a lot of periodic famines. We do, of course, see famines still in the world, which are very much political and conflict related, like we're seeing in Yemen. But in general, the kinds of periodic famines that we saw here in India and in other parts of the world are history now. And that is definitely a good thing. I think we can all agree that that's a good thing. On the other side of the ledger, as Ravina mentioned, not just the double burden, the triple burden, that there are more people who are overweight and obese in the world today than there are people who are chronically hungry. So we have approximately 2.1 billion people who are overweight or obese. At the same time, and even possibly in the same individual, we have very prevalent hidden hunger, micronutrient deficiencies. So people may be getting sufficient calories, but not sufficient micronutrients. And then the other aspect of that is, in this world of abundant and inexpensive calories, we still have approximately 800 million people who don't get enough not because it doesn't exist or not enough is produced, but because they can't afford it. So our global food system is very much facing this triple burden. In addition, water. We all think about water. And where is it going to come from in the future to produce more food to feed a growing population who's aspiring to a more water-intensive diet? Food production, food system is the major user of water in the world. So that's a big concern for the global food system. And also climate change, that farmers are already seeing in many parts of the world how they are vulnerable to extreme events, droughts, floods, rising temperatures, rising nighttime temperatures, and so on. So these are some of the good parts and bad parts of our global food system. And India's food system is a mirror of an amplification of all of these positives and negatives in the global food system. The Green Revolution has provided abundant and inexpensive calories, but we don't see the famines. And very much the country is seeing this triple burden with diabetes on the rise, with very prevalent micronutrient deficiencies. Half of the women in the country have iron deficient anemia, and children, large prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies in children. At the same time, a quarter of the population being undernourished. Groundwater depletion is a problem we all know about, and very much so, as we've seen in the political happenings recently, vulnerability of smallholder farmers, not just to climate change, but climate change adds to the extreme vulnerability and distress of farmers. So India's food system really amplifies the challenges that we have in the global food system. So here we see what's been happening in the Green Revolution since 1966. And this is a great success story, really a success story. Probably one of humanity's greatest achievements, to increase food production to such an extent where the amount of cereal production per person surpassed even the increase in population. And that's quite a feat. This is going back to 1966 to the present, and the increase in rice and wheat. Those were the focus of the Green Revolution. Those were the high-yielding crops. Those were the ones that people knew how to increase yields. And the other cereals, which sorghum, pearl millet, finger millet, these wonderful, you had all of those in there for the snacks. which used to be a higher proportion of overall cereal production, if we go way back to 1966, became a much smaller proportion of the overall cereal production. So it's not that they disappeared, but they became a much smaller proportion. So rice and wheat are C3 cereals, follow the C3 photosynthetic pathway, and the millets and maize are C4 cereals. They have a different photosynthetic pathway, which explains a lot of why we might expect them to be more beneficial from an environmental point of view. So here we have the C3 cereals, wheat and rice, and the C4 cereals. And there are many, many, many hundreds of types of millets, small millets, lots of varieties. C4 cereals, the cereals that follow the photosynthetic pathway of C4, it's an adaptation to hot and dry environments. So C4 plants are generally grasses in the tropics. And C3 most plants are C3, trees are C3, temperate plants are generally C3. It's a name because of the number of carbon atoms involved in the photosynthetic pathway. I won't drag you into all of that. But the point is that the C4 cereals have adapted to be able to be resilient to hot, dry environments. What they have is an extra, they concentrate the carbon dioxide within the leaf so that they don't have to open their stomates, their pores, so as much as C3 plants, and in that way they can be more, you require less water. So they're particularly adapted to hot, dry environments. So what we've seen with the Green Revolution is we've seen an increase in these C3 plants, which are not adapted to hot, dry environments, at the expense of the C4 plants, which are adapted to exactly the kinds of conditions that occur in much of the country, hot and dry. And with rising atmospheric CO2, we all have probably seen this kind of graph many, many times, that we are way outside currently anything that we've experienced in at least the last 400,000 years with rising CO2. So how might we think about these C3, C4 plants in a world of rising atmospheric CO2? We would expect that the C4 cereals would be more resilient to higher temperatures than C3 because that's the way they were designed. That's how they evolved in hot, dry environments. So they are appropriate for that kind of environment. But on the other hand, we know that CO2 acts like a fertilizer. There's a carbon fertilization effect, that we have more photosynthesis when there's more CO2. And because the C3 plants are sort of open to that CO2 and the C4 are sequestering that CO2, we would expect, and we know from many studies, that yields increase more for C3 than for C4. So that's the rice and wheat would benefit more than the millets. But then on the other side, you may have seen the coverage about the nutrient content of cereals reducing under a rising atmospheric CO2. For the same reason that yields would increase more for C3 and C4, we would expect the nutrient concentrations to reduce more for C3 and C4. So this is a positive for the C4, this is a positive for the C3, and this is another positive for the C3. So we have all of these different factors going on. How do we make sense of all of these climate change that's affecting the cereals and how they might be beneficial or not to a changing world? So what we've done with the colleagues who have been working on this project is look at several different aspects. Usually, the way that we think about agriculture or we think about projects that we do might look at just one dimension. So the Green Revolution was pretty much one dimension. The need is to increase productivity. Full stop. And it was successful in that. But now we're seeing the repercussions from not considering the full suite of dimensions. So there was increase in productivity, but there was also loss of nutrients because those nutritious cereals fell out. And there were all kinds of social repercussions that we could talk a long time about. But the point is that as we think about this extremely complex world that we live in now, we need to think about all different kinds of dimensions together when we make decisions about what crops should be grown or how should cities expand. We can't just think about one single dimension. So in this project, we've tried to take on that philosophy of thinking about multiple dimensions and ask the question, does it make sense, current fad of nutri-cereals, if that were really pervasive in the country, would it make sense? Would it be the right thing to do from multiple dimensions, from a nutrition point of view, from the point of view of water, which is so, we're facing such shortages of water, from the point of view of resiliency to climate variability, and with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. And you can probably think of other dimensions, but these are the dimensions that we have looked at in this project that I'll share with you. But all of that is layered on something really over and above probably the most important question if we think about should nutri-cereals become more a part of the production and consumption in the country, is would people eat it? I mean, we enjoyed our snacks, but would people really, if you gave them a preference, would they choose? There's a lot of cultural issues, there's a lot of status around white rice. Would people choose to, not just the urban elite, but would people choose the nutri-cereals over rice and wheat, and would farmers grow it? So those questions overshadow all of our environment and nutrition questions. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but we know it's extremely important. And importantly, are the yields high enough? Would it be possible to produce enough? And would the profitability be an incentive for farmers to grow it? So there's lots of different dimensions to this question. And like any complicated question, there's no easy answer. So what I want to do now is go around these this wheel: nutrition, water, climate resilience, and greenhouse gas emissions, and share with you what we've learned about that, and then come back and think about these other overarching questions. So on the nutrition side, we know that what I showed you before was the production side of it. From the consumption side of it, the consumption of the millets, the nutri-cereals, the C4 cereals, has declined very dramatically in the past couple of decades. This is overall national data declining from 35% of cereal consumption to 5% in the last 50 years or so. And so that's a big change in diets, and you can see why, because the production of rice and wheat was so dominant. A lot of that has actually gone to wheat, but overall we see a big reduction, big change in diets. And I ask people all the time, do you remember eating these cereals? Or do you eat these cereals? And I get a lot of answers like, my grandfather used to eat that, or my mother made that, or when I was a kid I would eat that. So it's still in the cultural memory, but disappearing fast. The main issue when it comes to the nutrition part is that milled rice, which makes up such a big part of diets, varies a lot geographically, as you all know, is low in micronutrients. So if we take iron here, this is just iron compared to the wheat is quite good in terms of iron, and the millets are relatively high in iron compared to milled rice, the polished rice. So that's a very clear problem with the pervasiveness of rice diets. But on the other hand, there's always an other hand. We have to have a lot of hands. there's always something else. So the millets are also high in anti-nutrients. So we have a nutritionist here. So please tell me if I say something wrong. Two nutrition people sitting next to each other. That the phytates in the millets act as a chemical bind. They chemically bind the, thank you. They chemically bind the minerals. So it's not available to be absorbed. So this issue of bioavailability is a big one that is, as far as I can read, is not very well understood. Some people say that phytates are anti-cancer. So there's research that needs to be done. So we see that in terms of the phytate anti-nutrient content of the millets, it's high. But then when we look, because the iron is so low here, when we look at the ratio of the phytate to iron, rice looks very bad. We want this ratio to be low for the bioavailability aspect, and the millets look preferable in terms of that ratio. But there is this, I think, more research is needed to really understand this anti-nutrient aspect. But it's very clear that rice is not a good choice in terms milled rice is not a good choice in terms of iron. And iron is one of the biggest micronutrient deficiencies in the country. And this is what has been happening. So there's amazing data collected by the National Statistical Survey Organization, NSSO, amazing data on consumption, what people consume, huge long lists of everything you can think of, every kind of brinjal and every kind of gobi, everything you can think of, big long list, national surveys, very thorough surveys about what people consume, and that has been done periodically, roughly every 5 years ago. So that's a very rich source of data. So we can take that data back to 1983 is the first survey that broke apart the cereals and see how consumption patterns have changed. This is a national average. National averages don't mean much in such a heterogeneous diets that we have, but this is national average for rural households, where just in terms of calories, so if we take that long list of what people are consuming and turn that into calories, we see, these are the millets, this branch here. So we see them dropping out of the diet. But because the calorie content of the different cereals is not all that different, it doesn't really make a lot of difference from a calorie point of view. This is other food items, non-cereal items, and the red is heme sources of iron, that's animal sources of iron, which is sort of the gold standard of iron sources because that's bioavailable without phytates. So from a calorie point of view, there's been some substitution of other food items, so not a big deal from a calorie point of view. When we turn this into iron, all of those items that people are consuming, the cereals, other items, and animal iron sources, into iron, we see something, I found this very alarming, that the C4 cereals, the millets, dropping out, as we know, from the consumption, which would not really be a problem if other sources of iron were coming into the diet. But that's not what the data shows. The data shows that that iron source is dropping out, and there's nothing that's really compensating for it. So I found this very upsetting, actually, that if there were an increase in other items that were providing that iron, it would be fine, but it's not. These iron-rich cereals are dropping out of the diets with nothing coming in to make up for that. So of course, averages are just averages. This is a national average. How does this break apart across states? We all know how varied diets are across states. So here are a couple of examples. Gujarat, where bajra, pearl millet, going back to 1983, was a very important source of iron, and it still is, but it has dropped out somewhat. Andhra Pradesh, big rice-based diets, where jowar, sorghum, was a bigger part of the diet, and that has dropped out without being compensated elsewhere in the diet. And Kerala, the outlier for everything, is an example where other food items have increased the iron source, and there's a lot more heme iron. So Kerala is the only state where we see this kind of pattern, where we have an increase in iron from other sources, but all the others show patterns like this. Varying, but patterns like this, where the other food groups aren't compensating for the iron. So that's not a great story. And where do we see this in terms of the population, different segments of the population? If you want to get the most iron in your diet, the best thing to be is wealthy, top quartile income in a rural household. The worst you can be is urban bottom quartile. They've all dropped from this consumption data. We see that they've all dropped in terms of iron, per capita iron, but the most steepest drop has been in the rural poor, where if you just go back to 1983, the per capita iron consumption was on par with urban wealthy diets, and that has declined significantly. And we can come back and talk about why that might be the case. All of this is below the recommended intake, which is about up here somewhere. But definitely this problem of the nutricereals dropping out of the diets is the most severe in rural poor populations. And they're not going to be going online and going to Fab India and buying the nutricereals that we enjoy. So then we ask the question, okay, we've seen this change in the diet. If nutricereals, the millets, came back into the diet, might we see an improvement in anemia or reduction in the prevalence of anemia? So we did an analysis. We looked at state-level data, the prevalence of anemia for women and for children, and looked at that in terms of the iron sources from different, the iron sources and the inhibitors and different aspects of the diet to see this is just a correlation, to see what might be correlated. So we do see that for women, a significant correlation between iron in cereals and anemia prevalence, which only suggests that if the consumption of iron in cereals was to increase, then perhaps anemia prevalence would reduce. For children, we didn't find that. We found that there was a significant association between heme iron, that's iron in animal-sourced foods, and the prevalence of children's anemia, which is, of course, we have to understand this further, but is certainly something to think about when we think about midday meals, as including millets in midday meals. Would that really help anemia for children? We also find significance, now other people have found this also, the higher the female education in the household, the female head in the household, lower the anemia for children and for women also, and some correlation with sanitation. So it's not, these results suggest that increasing nutricerial consumption could reduce anemia for women, but lots of question marks when it comes to children. More work to be done on that. So from the nutrition side, it's clear, I think, that nutricereals would provide more micronutrients, particularly iron, into the diet. There's still questions about the bioavailability, about children, but I think it's a pretty clear story that the nutricereals are superior to rice, at least to rice, than and we've seen them drop out of the diet. So if they came back, it's a good argument for improving nutrition. Now let's go around this wheel. Let's move over to the water side of it. We know that water is such a big constraint and depleting groundwater and so on, that the way the grain revolution really watered its crops was through a double crop, through having irrigation during the Rabi, during the winter crop. And we see this clearly in the statistics about water use. So the blue is irrigation, the green is surface water precipitation sources. So big increase in water use, and this is work from the postdoc Kyle Davis, where he modeled the water requirements for different crops, the different cereals, and calculated how much water would be required per calorie, per gram of iron, and compared the different cereals. So in terms of producing iron, at least, rice uses a lot of water, and other cereals, the millets and wheat also, using far less water to produce the same amount of nutrient. So from a water point of view, as we would expect for these C4 cereals, just based on their physiology and the fact that they have this evolutionary adaptation to hot, dry climates, we would expect them to use less water. I'm going to go around the wheel again. Climate resilience, big issue. India is a hot spot for climate change. We can expect temperatures to increase. So the question is, if nutricereals were produced more in the country, would that make farmers less vulnerable to variability in precipitation or temperature? How sensitive are the different cereals to this variability? So again, from a physiological evolutionary point of view, we would expect the C4 cereals to be more resilient. Do we actually see that when we put that to data? So here's a lot of squiggly lines that show the yields of different cereals compared to rice in the same places where those are grown, so taking only districts where both of those are grown. And the more squiggly it is, the more sensitive that cereal would be to variations in precipitation and temperature. So doing an analysis to see what that sensitivity is, we see that in an extreme dry year, taking the driest year on record, how much would that make a hit on the yield? So if you have a cereal that's very sensitive, if it's an extreme dry year, you would lose a lot. If you have a cereal that's less sensitive and you have an extreme dry year, you would lose less. So that's what we want. We want less sensitive cereals. So what we see here is that this is rice, the orange one here. How much would the yield reduce in an extreme dry year and an extreme hot year compared to the different cereals? And rice, from this analysis, is more sensitive, as we would expect, than the other cereals. So from a climate resilience point of view, there's a pretty strong argument for the nutricereals. Now, greenhouse gases, okay, that's really clear because rice is emits methane, flooded rice emits methane. So here's an analysis of comparing the greenhouse gas in terms of CO2 equivalents across the different cereals. Some of the CO2 comes from machinery, fertilizer, manufacturing, different aspects of production, but the main greenhouse gas emissions comes from methane, mostly methane, some nitrous oxide from fertilizer, but rice being a big methane emitter. So it's pretty clear from that point of view also. So from all of these points of view, nutrition, water use, climate resilience, greenhouse gas emissions, one could make an argument for nutricereals. And in fact, the government last April declared nutricereals in the Gazette. So there's a lot of attention on this now, a lot of attention. which is good. But it's also good to not jump and to understand and analyze where would it be beneficial and to which populations and how it could be done. But there's a lot of attention now on nutricereals, particularly including them in the public distribution system. But there is a problem. There's a really big problem. And that is that in general, the yields of here, millets and sorghum, these are the three big, that have gotten so much research attention. The yields are much higher. So it really, to make an argument that production of nutricereals should take over from rice and wheat would not be a great idea, because if the yields are so low, the yields are so much lower, then how are you going to produce enough to feed everyone? So, so this is makes the considerations a lot more complicated than just, oh, nutricereals, it's great for all of these different dimensions, because the yields really are lower on average. Although there are parts of the country, central India being one of them where I work, where the yields of millets are actually higher than the yields of rice. The yields of rice are very low. So in those places, it's clear. But in terms of the national average, it's not just a straight story that nutricereals are the solution to all of India's food system problems. Not at all. So just putting all of this together, just what's happened over the last, the Green Revolution story, is that basically there's just been a very basic trade-off of increasing yields for micronutrient content, for water efficiency, for climate resilience, for greenhouse gas emissions. It's just very clear that the focus has been on the high yielding for good reason, for a very good reason, because production needed to increase. But there has been this trade-off. So is it time to rebalance that trade-off? Rethink that kind of trade-off. So what we did was taking this consideration about the differences in yields. We did some optimizations. Now, optimizations are things that academics like us like to do, and they have really nothing to do with the real world. But we do them as thought experiments. So the thought experiment here is, if the goal was to keep production in terms of calories, tons, the same as today, without taking a hit on the production, and without increasing crop area, because there's really not space left to increase crop area, and you change the amount of these different millets being produced in different places where it made sense, where the yields were higher, and you did a whole optimization to try to maintain calorie production and maintain cropped area. That's supposed to say cropped area. Could you do that, first of all? And where would you do that? So taking those places where these alternative cereals are already produced, if you increase increase their production in those areas, particularly in those areas where the yields are higher than they are of rice, and you optimized, what would the map look like where they would be produced? So you could optimize for different things. In this case, this is what the map looks like if you optimize for maximum resilience. How do you grow? What's the distribution of different cereals if you get the most climate resilience out of it while keeping calorie production constant, the same, not losing calorie production and not increasing crop area? So you can run these. I mean, it's kind of like a game. You can run it and maximize anything you want. So we maximized resilience, we maximized iron production, we maximized protein production, we maximized, minimized greenhouse gases, minimized water use, and just to see what those trade-offs look like. If you made decisions to increase nutricereal production in places where you would maximize resilience, would you lose out on water? Would you lose out on nutrients? Are there trade-offs? So we know that we have the big trade-off in yield and all these other dimensions, but would you start trading off these other dimensions? Because you would want to know that, because we know the problems of the world are largely You know, a lot of problems in the world are created because we don't think about all these dimensions. So let's think about all of these dimensions. So this is how a map would look if you optimized for maximum resilience. And then you could also optimize for maximum iron. You get a little bit of a different map. The question is, if you maximize for iron, how much you get more iron. This is the current. The dotted line is the current iron production. So if you're above that, that's good. That's a bonus. I mean, that's what you want to do. Produce more. If you maximize for climate resilience, in this case, what would that look like in terms of iron? Because iron was not the thing you were optimizing for. Would you lose out on iron? The answer here is no, you get a little bit of a boost, not as much as you're maximizing iron. Similarly, with climate resilience, if you grow the crop that's going to be the least sensitive, you would avoid a lot of loss during a drought year. If you maximize for iron, you'll be also getting some resilience, but not nearly as much. So this is just playing with these different optimizations and different constraints and trying to optimize. So lots of pinwheels here. But the point is that in all cases, we don't really see hard trade-offs. We don't really see if you tried to produce the most iron, would that eat into your water? In fact, that would save you some water. If you tried to reduce your greenhouse gases here, minimize your greenhouse gases, would that mean that you were going to lose out on iron? And that's not the case here. So what we learned from all of this, all of these pinwheels, is that it's mostly, in most cases, whatever you optimize for, whether your goal is to increase iron production or minimize water use or maximize climate resilience or minimize greenhouse gas production, pretty much you get benefits all across those different dimensions. So that's a good thing to know. Also, it's good to know, just in this academic exercise, that it's possible to increase the production and get these benefits without reducing overall production, because that would be an absolute non-starter to reduce overall production. So we continue to play around with these. As I said, this is the kind of thing we like to do, but we know that it's only a thought exercise, that there are a lot of considerations, that you can't just wave a wand and say, make the map look like we think it should look. And one of those is the preferences. Would people really want to eat the Nutri-Cereals, and would farmers want to grow it? And I don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of, cultural, white rice is a status food, stigma against Nutri-Cereals. I don't know the answer, and it would be good to find out what people would actually choose if the price were acceptable, because currently the price of rice is so, we can see why the rural poor, why we see that steep decline in the rural poor. So this is a PDS shop, a public distribution system outlet, which is down the street from my place in Madhya Pradesh. And if you could read the writing here, you would see that for people households below the poverty line, they can get rice for 1 rupee a kilo. Now you can't beat that, 1 rupee a kilo. So of course, that's what people have been eating. And almost half of the rural population depends on, at least for part of their cereal consumption, on the public distribution system. It's massive and important. It's the biggest food security program in the world, and people depend on it. And there is some discussion about including Nutri-Cereals in the PDS, and some states have been, Karnataka and some other states, have been experimenting with including nutricereals in the PDS system. So the PDS system has an enormous impact on what people consume because they're getting the cereals highly subsidized, and also what farmers produce because the government is, with the minimum support price, guaranteeing a price for the farmers and procuring. So it has a massive, massive influence on production and consumption. Is it a good idea to have the nutricereals in the PDS? There are a lot of issues. We had a workshop about this in Hyderabad last year, and a lot of different issues came out. It's not obvious. There's storage issues, there's transport issues, is there enough to procure issues, there's aflatoxin issues. There's just a lot of different issues, and it's not just do this and it happens, but it certainly seems to be, from my point of view, something worth thinking about as one possible way to get back some of what was lost as people drop the nutricereals out of their diet. There's also a lot of technical issues for the engineers here. There's one of the big issues with the millets is that they have a hard husk, and milling technology has not kept pace. So the last thing we would want to do would be to try to promote a cereal where a woman would have to beat it for 3 hours every day. That's just drudgery. But there has been some small-scale milling kinds of solutions, but there is a big milling. The milling is definitely an issue about how that would have to be addressed if nutricereals were going to be more widely consumed. So that's a good engineering challenge. So there are still lots and lots of questions. We continue, and a lot of people are starting to think about this from a nutrition and acceptance point of view. Would people really want to eat it? We need to learn more about the anti-nutrients, glycemic index, a whole other set of issues around that. If it's a good idea to promote nutricereals, what's the right policy lever? Is it the public distribution system, midday meals, subsidies, private sector plays a role? That's getting into the policy sphere, which is outside of my research area, but definitely important. And engineering and management, milling, as I said, how to close the yield gap. There just hasn't been investment and research on improved varieties for the millets. If that were the case, how would you close that yield gap? Would fortification just be a better idea? I don't know if the nutritionists can say about that. Lots of different issues. So I've seen just changes in diets just in the 35 years that I've been observing. The massive changes in diets has occurred, both urban and rural populations, and I'm glad to see so many people thinking about it, and we can think together about whether nutricereals are a fad for the urban elite or can make a dent into environmental and nutrition problems that we face here. Thank you.